together that there is a purpose that we cannot forget. It's a simple idea, but it's something that I think we take for granted a lot of times. We're supposed to know the Bible. We're supposed to read the Bible. We're supposed to be in the Bible. But there is nothing about the Bible that is simply a mental exercise. There's nothing about studying the Scripture that is only a thought experiment. And I remember that when I read things like the letters to the Ephesians or others that Paul writes, where he spends so much time talking about, teaching lessons. Here's some stuff you need to know. In Ephesians chapter 1, he talks about the prayers that he offers in chapter 1 and verse 16 to God for the church there at Ephesus and for the Christians there. He prays for their knowledge. He prays that they will learn things. And then in chapter 2, he talks about things like verse 1, how they were dead in their trespasses and they were dead in their sins. In verse 11, how they were Gentiles according to the flesh and they were outcast and they didn't have a place in the world. And teaching these lessons and talking about this doctrine and doing all of this stuff, he talks about in chapter 3 and verse 7 that he was made a minister of the gospel according to God's grace. And he talks about what it means to be a minister. And he talks about bringing light. He talks about what God's plan is. He talks about more praying in chapter 3 and verse 14. Over and over again, he talks about these lessons that we're supposed to learn. Here's stuff. You need to know this stuff. But then there's always a chapter 4 and verse 1. There's always a word, and usually it's several times, over and over, repeated again and again. Therefore. And if you wanted to do it in Ephesians, you could count all of the therefores. I'm telling you this stuff. This stuff is true. This stuff is important. And now that I have told you this stuff, therefore, I urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called. Chapter 5 and verse 1. Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children and walk in love. Over and over again, after teaching the lessons, after talking about the doctrine, after enlightening our minds, there is the direction that we're supposed to go with it. It's the difference between, if you'll let me be crass, Sunday morning when we come to church and we listen, and Monday morning when we go to work and we're supposed to put it into practice. And so tonight the reminder is we're here to learn, but we're here to do so much more with what we learn. We're not here just for the sake of learning. We are here to learn so that at the conclusion of this hour tonight, we can go out tomorrow and be lights in this world. And I pray that we have that type of mentality when we come together and then when we leave. That you're going to be equipped tonight. You're going to be given something that you're going to be able to take home, that you're going to be able to take to work, that you're going to be able to take to school or to the grocery store or wherever it is that you may find yourself, that will make you capable of doing God's work wherever you find yourself. And tonight, if you need help or encouragement to be able to do that, then this moment is yours. This time for you to come forward and to say, here is my need. Here is why I currently cannot do what I need to do. And we will help meet that need however we can. If you'd like to take advantage of that right now, then come forward while together we stand and sing this song.
Father, If you'd like to keep your songbooks open there, we'll sing the third verse here in just a moment as we dismiss the class. Then the things some ways you're not supposed to do tonight. Doug, Adam, anybody else in here?
Gum in my mouth. And every once in a while I had to take a breath because if you know about chewing gum, it's not a good thing. We're saying, just stay in here. Teenagers are going to stay in here this evening, Brother Doug just told me. Both boys and girls, sir. I assume. Couple of announcements. Brother Gary asked me, since I was up here, if I would mind to do those again. This coming Sunday, annually we honor those graduates, whether it be from high school or college, or whether it was in December or coming up here in May. So we will begin that at 10 o'clock, and we always have kind of some pictures to represent that and also something to give to those graduates. So if you're one of those, please plan to be here as we will honor you, and then the dinner will be following services at 6:30. If you have not let Susie know in the office, please give her a call. It says in the opportunity worksheet, and let her know by Friday. That way they can plan. Also, as you read down through here, a couple of things of note. We want to express our sympathy to Lyndon and Willie Jackson over the passing of Willie's sister. Her name was Betty Sparks, and her service was held on Sunday in North Carolina, and we want to keep them in our prayers. As far as sick go this evening, Brother Gary did tell me that the only one that he is aware of in the hospital is Zoli Carpenter. We mentioned him on Sunday. We want to continue to keep him in our prayers. Other than that, there are many who are listed here that we want to keep in prayers. Please remember those who are shut in. We also have several upcoming teas for those getting married. So I know there's always a good help for those of our congregation. Also, please note the visitors, as we've had more that have felt comfortable coming on Sundays. We want to welcome them as well to our number. Does anybody else have any more announcements? And we'll dismiss to our classes as follows. Remember, teenagers still, please remain in here. Brother Doug, you were talking to Adam. Girls and boys staying here. So you young ladies and men stay in here as well. We'll dismiss the two groups then. I guess that's kindergarten down, downstairs here in just a moment, except for those nursery age. They have the nursery available. And then first grade through sixth will be back there in the back room. So let's sing the last verse of Father Alone while those are dismissed. When we see Jesus coming in glory, when it comes from his home in the sky, then we shall meet him in that bright mansion. We'll understand it all by and by. Father alone will know all about it. Father alone will understand why. Cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by. All right, our panel's group got to go. Sorry.
Who? Yeah, everybody who's not supposed to be here for class is ready to be dismissed. Come on. All right, our panel tonight is Miss Adria and Mr. Gary. No, Gary, don't walk out that door. You are here tonight. I am very thankful for it, too. Yeah. Saturday, for those who don't know or don't remember, the East Colbert congregation has their fish fry fundraiser for the mission work that they do. It is takeout only, but that will be taking place this Saturday across the river. So, and I also wanted to say we've had one pair of sunglasses been here for a couple weeks, and then one pair of looks like reading glasses or spectacles for somebody. So if those look familiar to you, then you probably don't need them because you can't see them all the way up here. But they have a purple frame, and if that sounds familiar, and you've been missing your glasses, then feel free to come back and join us. As we turn our attention tonight to our panel discussion, I read it just about 10 minutes before I came in here to the auditorium tonight. If you remember last year, February the 23rd of 2020, just when all of the COVID stuff was heating up and getting, we were beginning to think that it was going to become something. There was a young man jogging in his neighborhood in Georgia, and 3 men followed him, chased after him with guns, and when he did not meet their demands, they shot him in the middle of the street. His name was Ahmaud Arbery, and he was a black gentleman, and the 3 individuals that chased him down were white, and they said that they were justified in doing what they did because they thought he had walked into a construction site for a home that was being built in the neighborhood, and they were trying to detain him until the authorities could arrive and deal with him properly. And when they told him to stop and he didn't, they drew their guns, and he, for some crazy reason, tried to run away from them. And so they shot him. They were convicted today, each of them, for one account of hate crime and other crimes involving weaponry and things like that. It's just one of several instances that have taken place in our country over the last year that has raised awareness, if you'll allow me to use that idea, about the concept of oppression and injustice in our world. And Ecclesiastes does not shy away from difficult subjects, as much as Adrian and Gary probably wish that it did. Because this, in my opinion, is the trickiest of all of the subjects we've dealt with thus far. It comes from Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and then another passage in chapter 8. You're more than welcome to turn there in just a moment, but we're going to try to get to the bottom of some of this and how we as Christians are supposed to deal with these things. And Ecclesiastes does talk a great deal about oppression. The first slide that I wanted us to look at has some passages just through Ecclesiastes together. This is material from K.J. Moore is his name. We'll watch a couple of video segments from him tonight that I'm glad we get to share. But notice what Ecclesiastes says about oppression. In chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, "Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness. And in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and every work." In chapter 4 and verse number 1, "Again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they have no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, but there was no one to comfort them." From our section tonight, chapter 5, verse number 8, it reads, "If you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter." We'll get into what that means a little bit more tonight, but there is that statement. In chapter 7, in verse number 7, "Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart." Bribery being one of those methods of oppression. In chapter 10, verses 5 and following, "There's an evil that I have seen under the sun, as it were an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in many high places. The rich sit in a low place. I've seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground as slaves." In the same chapter, verses 16 and 17, "Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child, and your princes feast in the morning. Happy are you, land, when your king is the son of nobility, and your princes feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness." Talking about different rulers who abuse their power and use it for their own gain rather than for the good of the land. There's a lot of discussion in Ecclesiastes about people being taken advantage of. And this wasn't one of our study questions, but I wanted to ask the question and think about who today is typically taken advantage of. It can be groups of people, or it can be how individuals can become a part of that group that is mistreated or oppressed or deals with injustice in some shape, form, or fashion. Can you who are some things, people, relationships you think of that fall into that category of being very susceptible to being taken advantage of?
I think the poor.
The poor, yes. I don't know, Jim, did we unmute the mics back there? But so the poor is certainly one of the groups that I thought of because, like it says in Ecclesiastes, they don't have any power on their side.
Well, and if they get in trouble, they can't afford legal counsel like someone that is wealthier.
Absolutely. So they're often at a disadvantage because the system favors those who can be represented and get legal help. So that's a good point.
One group that we don't really focus in on a lot of times, elderly people.
The elderly, that's exactly
And
right.
I guess with my line of work, I tend to see it a little bit more, but and you see it in the paper a little bit more. They've got crime, or people can be charged with crimes now for taking advantage of the elderly people, but it happens a lot more than we realize.
I think I was reminded of that. Was it maybe 2 years ago? Mickey Rooney. A lot of y'all remember the famous actor Mickey Rooney. For a long time, and his estate got caught up in a whole bunch of stuff because some people were taking advantage of him, and some other things like that. But yeah, definitely.
I saw in the paper today one girl here locally was charged from taking from her grandmother. She had embezzled $500,000.
$500,000. Taking advantage. Yep, Rogers? Yes, the scams.
Yeah.
I guarantee you a scammer hopes that they hear somebody who sounds like they're a little bit elderly because they can talk them. A lot of times they're not familiar with all of the ins and outs of how things work, and it's easy to take advantage of them through that. So be aware of that. Brother Lewis? Yes. Yes.
There were 1,500 children in 5 counties that were being abused.
1,500 kids in those 5 counties being abused.
And the problem, not only is it the abuse, is what can the judge do in the court
Right.
once it's brought to his.
Once it's brought to light.
Sometimes the law works at a disadvantage because it places the child back into the home that it came out.
In a situation that's still not safe, but don't have the ability to do anything about. So the young, the elderly, Dave, who were you going to mention? That we definitely, I think, still see that in some ways. Part of tonight we may get into, some of this institutional, discussions of things and have different viewpoints on that. But the statistics, at least in some regards, don't lie in terms of, how many people in our country are of color and how many are in prison, what the numbers there are and other things like that. But there do seem to be some disadvantages that I don't have to deal with. So that's a possibility. Amy?
With me seeing this and everything, I think that if you are mentally or physically abused, then, anything could happen, and look, they're going to jail, prison, wherever.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's supposed to protect people from those kinds of abuses, but a lot of times, basically, I feel like in some sense, anybody's voice can be taken away from them. And when you don't have the ability to speak up and say, I'm being mistreated, then you are a prime candidate for injustice, abuse, or something like that. As long as other people know about what's going on, it's a lot less likely sometimes to be, for that to continue. But if someone can put you in a corner or put you in a dark room where nobody sees and nobody knows, anybody can be caught in that kind of situation and be found in a very, a very dangerous place. As we think about that oppression, as we think about the idea that there are people who are mistreated in this world that we live in, we're going to turn here to Ecclesiastes 5, and we're going to turn to Ecclesiastes 8, and we're going to try to see what Solomon, in his wisdom, has to say about that from the earthly perspective. And then we're going to turn our attention to the spiritual perspective, to the heavenly perspective. So I want us to watch a video about 3 minutes long. This is the longest video that we'll watch tonight.
And so we then go to Ecclesiastes.
And we probably need to turn the computer volume. Or whoever's on the soundboard. I'm going to start it.
And so we then go to Ecclesiastes
All right, turn
5
that up a little bit loud.
and verse 8. And this first point that he makes is
A little bit louder.
troubling at first glance, because what it seems like he's saying is, yeah, these things are happening, but don't be too overwhelmed by them. I'm like, what are you talking about? But he says there, if you see in a province the oppression of the poor And so we then go to Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 8, and this first point that he makes is troubling at first glance, because what it seems like he's saying is, yeah, these things are happening, but don't be too overwhelmed by them. I'm like, what are you talking about? But he says there, if you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter. For the high official is watched by a higher, and there are yet higher ones over them. But this is gain for a land in every way.
That's my fault. I just did that. I'm sorry.
A king committed to cultivated fields. What is he talking about? Well, every high official is watched by another. There's this principle of accountability that follows. And so you go up this hierarchy, the high official here and the higher official and the higher official, but then what about this highest one up here that seems like there isn't a single person holding them accountable? Well, may I suggest that the highest official is God, and he's going to hold all of them accountable. Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 13 talks about the fact that the wicked are not going to escape the judgment seat of God. And so it's better to have a ruler even still than to not have a ruler. That's what we see in verse 9. And now I want to make it very clear that per 1 Samuel 8 and verse 5, that it's true that these earthly rulers were only among God's people because they wanted to be more like the other nations. That's completely clear. But if you'll notice in 1 Samuel 9 and verse 16, God appointed them, even still. I have someone for you from Benjamin. It wasn't a decision that was made by the Israelites. It was made, at the end of the day, still by God. But preacher, Israel was a theocracy, and you're absolutely right. I'm with you there. But God, through his permissive will, does he not allow these rulers to still come into power? Does he not allow them to reign on the throne? Daniel 2 and verse 21. And so that takes us to chapter 8, verses 2 through 4. This is where things get even more complicated. Welcome to Ecclesiastes. But what we see in verses 2 through 4 is this. I say, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? There's a lot of discussion that goes into verse 2 especially, but let me just make it very clear and to the point. The action is obedience, and the reason is God. Plain and simple. And verse 3 continues that thought by saying to not rashly react, especially when we're talking about things that the king does. And so this would mean that we need to stay away from defiant actions such as an overthrowing of or secession from or rebellion against government. These are not things that the Bible authorizes.
All right, as we come through this, let's see, I'm trying to bring it up again. He covers Ecclesiastes 5 and he covers Ecclesiastes 8, and he talks about a lot of stuff about where rulers come from. He reminds us that, initially the kings of Israel were only put in place because the Israelites wanted to look like who? They want to look like all the nations around them, right? So, yes, initially that wasn't a good purpose, but God still selected who was going to be the rulers. And today, as we get into Romans 13 in just a little bit, God is still in charge of who the rulers are, and there is still an obligation there to them. And so as a result of those things, we have to first begin with civil obedience. We have to first begin with what our obligations are to the leaders in high places and why we are to be in subjection to them before we can talk about anything else that may be significant. So in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, he mentions these two things. He says what Solomon is pointing out here is that rulers are, one, they are accountable, and two, they are appointed. In accountability, he mentions, where is it? In Ecclesiastes 5, verse 7. Do not be amazed at the matter, verse 8. For the high official is watched by a higher, and there are yet higher ones over them. So in other words, there is accountability, and we'll get into that accountability in just a little bit. But then the second thing is they are also appointed by God. They have been given their place. He quotes Daniel chapter 2 and verse 21. God changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. So there's this first foremost idea that we are to be obedient in a civil setting. And so one of the study questions, I think this was question number 3, if we see injustice around us, whether it's in the system or in just life in general, how can we maintain our obedience? How can we maintain our allegiance and still combat this injustice and any time that we see injustice around us? Gary, what did you think about that, or where else do you want to take that?
Well, we have an obligation to obey the laws. We may not like them. I don't like paying taxes. If you do, we need to talk. But we have to obey the law, and most laws are for our safety. That's the reason we don't have an Autobahn where Florence Boulevard is. We've got speed limits for our safety. So we've got the obligation that we have to obey the laws, but there are going to be times when things are going to go the way we don't want them to go. What comes into my mind is Philippians chapter 2, verse 14. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. We've got an obligation to shine our lights because that's what Christ wants us to do, and hopefully when things are not going bad, we can make our voices heard. Voting booths one of the biggest ones.
Right.
But peaceful demonstrations, peaceful debates.
Sure.
That's, most time you don't have a debate, you have an arguing contest. But that's just kind of what I think.
I agree with that. And I think you make a good point from Philippians. The world is a wicked place. We can't be surprised that the world is full of evil things because the world is full of evil people. And not everyone is going to try to do what is right. And so because of that, there will be people who are always trying to take advantage of other people, and that's what the nature of oppression is. And so how to fight that is to be a counterweight, be a balance on the other end, be a light in the darkness. That's a good point. Adria, what did you think about?
I was thinking about getting on a personal level with people that are suffering from injustices, having a conversation, being able to understand their experiences, and then seeing what they would like us to help them with.
That's a great, and we've heard that a lot over the past year, be a listener rather than a solver. But it also reminds me, we just talked about anyone who's oppressed, the first thing that happens is their voice is taken away from them. They don't have a place to either cry out for justice or to ask for help, and they begin to feel invisible. And so, just what you've suggested to do, to go to them, to make them know that they are seen, to make them know that they haven't been forgotten, that they still have dignity, and then ask what we can do, what can I do? Not just from what can the world do for you? It doesn't matter what the world can do for them. It matters what I can do. And so what can I do right here and now? Steve? That's an excellent question. It's such a good question. What is oppression? That's such a good question. I'm going to let Gary answer it.
Remember, we have a meeting after a while.
Oh, that's right. That's right. But that's a great point. Let's take a minute. All three of us up here talk about what oppression, I'm not looking for the clinical correct answer, the correct definition, but how do you see oppression? What is oppression in your perspective?
Well, I think it's a matter of personal perspective.
I think so too. That's why I think this is
I
beneficial.
I feel oppressed by my insurance company. Seriously, they came out with a law a few years ago called the Affordable Care Act.
Right.
My affordable care went out the roof.
Affordable is not the right term.
It's not the right term, and that oppresses me. And there's other things that I could, say maybe oppress me, but each one of you have something different. And, oppression doesn't have a specific gender, race, color,
Right.
whatever. It's everybody's going to be oppressed in some shape, form, or fashion. Some groups worse than others.
I agree with that. That's a good point. Adrian, what would you add?
I was just thinking about, people being held back from having fair treatment, being able to access services or
Right.
different things that, everybody should be entitled to.
Right.
Everybody deserves respect and
That's
to
kind
be
of where,
treated
yeah.
fairly.
I think that's maybe where my mind was going to is, as a human being, we're supposed to be, according to our founding documents, we have these unalienable rights. That means they're not supposed to be able to be taken away from us, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? That's what, we talk about a lot of times. I don't know if those are the unalienable rights, but as a person who's been made in the image of God, respect is something that we should not have to fight for. To be treated equally, to be treated with compassion, to be looked at as a human being, regardless of how much money I make or what kind of clothes I'm wearing or what my gender or race or any of those other things is. So oppression, in one sense, is when someone intentionally tries to undermine that basic fundamental treatment of me as a human being. And again, that definition of oppression has been tossed around an awful lot in the last 20 years. The Supreme Court rules that certain types of marriages are now, they have to be legal because otherwise you are oppressing someone from their fundamental human right. Whether or not that's accurate or not, that's up for discussion. But at the end of the day, I think a basic starting point has to be, we have the right to be treated certain ways. No matter what we've done, right or wrong, no matter how good or bad we are. And when someone comes along and swipes that away from us and begins to treat us as less than human, then we could say that we're being oppressed. Does that make sense? Richard.
Two things that involve a differential in power.
A differential in power, that's a good point. Usually oppression happens because someone has more power than the other. Ecclesiastes has already brought that out, so good reminder.
And two, it's something that is done to people of the group.
So it can be because you have defined a group of people in such a way that it allows you to mistreat them. So that can be one way to look at it. Okay, I see that. I see the value of that. All right, Brother Lewis, and then Sister Jane.
We happen to live in probably the very best countries ever been in the face of Europe.
Throughout all time.
And if you oppress as a group, there's a way to handle it. You got a representative in the government. So and see what goes on in this country.
Right.
And most of the news I can't watch with my wife
Nope.
because of the filter.
Absolutely.
We still have to follow the law. If we don't follow the law,
Right.
Burning the town does not.
We are still obligated to follow the law. And that's, again, the point that he's making in Ecclesiastes is it's better to have a king than not have a king. And sometimes it's even better to have a bad king than to have no king at all, because anarchy creates much more confusion and problem and oppression in much smaller pockets, but much more damaging ways. And so it's up to individuals, the system. I hate using that term, but the legal system, the judicial system, the government system, these things are put in place because they are supposed to give a voice to the people who may not have one otherwise. They're supposed to be there to protect people who are vulnerable already, whether it's the elderly or the handicapped or those who are too young or those who are, for whatever reason, unable to speak for themselves. And when those systems do their job, then things are better. But it's not ever going to be perfect.
God puts in place in the country. I think all you got to do is look at history in our lifetime.
Okay?
How long did Hitler last?
Right.
How long did the Soviet Union last?
Right. These.
There's a guy trying to remove each other.
Yeah, he is. Be careful. But yes, the long arc of history is, bends towards somebody who's smarter than I am. How does that finish? Justice. Bends towards justice. Now that's Martin Luther King Jr. That's not Adam Richardson. The long arc of history bends towards justice. It may not be right now. It may not be right in 5 years, but eventually Hitler's going to fall, and eventually the Iron Curtain's going to drop, and eventually, these oppressive things are going to lose out, because because of these things that we're talking about being lights, and it will make a difference. Jane, what were you going to say? Okay. Miss Jane Cooper wants to dive right into the deep end, boys and girls. And she's exactly right. That is a form of taking away the voice of someone. Gender is definitely, we are facing, let me just tell you this as quickly as I possibly can. The churches of Christ right now in the Southeast are facing a crisis of roles and responsibilities within the local congregation, because there is a growing group of people who are dissatisfied with the amount or how often or how respected women are in the local congregation. And because of that, there are people who are trying to change what the Bible says about those roles and responsibilities. And I don't think you do either. What they're doing is they are overreacting to a genuine problem. A genuine problem is that when we have these discussions, sometimes, and I'm guilty of it myself, it is easier to listen to the louder, deeper voices. And that's just what men typically tend to have, And because we don't, let me just be as transparent as I can. That's why we're doing these panel discussions on Wednesday nights. And that's why I'm really thankful for the ladies in our congregation who have been willing to take part in them. Because it is not changing the roles and responsibilities within the church. We're not abandoning that by any means. But we are allowing voices to be heard. And I want to make sure that we're always clear about that. This isn't anybody being given a role that they're not supposed to have, because we still have the authority that is given to us in Scripture. But that doesn't mean that we silence 50% of our population and they don't have anywhere ever that they can speak up. Because there is so much, I'm just going to... Adria's made a great contribution to the discussion that we've already had tonight, and the other ladies have, who have been here before, and we would be missing that if ladies like Gwen and Chelsea and others hadn't been willing to come up here and do that. Gary?
And I was just going to add, we say it over and over, and this may be a good time to say it again. The elders meet every Wednesday night, and it's open for anybody. I mean, we've had ladies come and discuss matters with us before, and we've had some of our lady members to even go as far as writing us letters questioning some of the things that we were doing, and we respect that. And we take it very seriously, and we discuss it, and we'll discuss it with the ladies. We're not trying to push anybody out of the way.
Be dismissive. That's exactly right. Now, Miss Adria, would you like to say anything? It would be really dumb of me to say all of that and then just be like, so moving on.
No, I'm good.
Okay. And as long as she's good, then we're good, right? All right, Brother Rogers?
Well, it's been stated tonight, this is one of the greatest countries in history.
It is.
We got to remember one Bible verse. Righteousness exalts the nation,
Mm-hmm.
but sin is reproaching the people. This country is becoming more and more and more unrighteous.
We are unfortunately not falling into the footsteps of righteous people who've come before us. And that's exactly right. Part of this discussion is, and I mean, I'm on slide number 5 of 17, and we got 6 minutes left. So, man, good discussion tonight. But later on, it talks about how we cannot turn our country into an idol. We cannot turn any of our leaders into idols. And when we are unwilling, the whole point of civil disobedience is, just because we submit to the government authorities or whoever, doesn't mean we agree with everything that they do. And if we get to a position where we are unwilling to criticize a particular leader, even when they are doing something wrong, then that is dragging us into unrighteousness. And so we have to be willing to do that. So I don't know if we'll get to that later on in our discussion topic tonight, but I did want to go ahead and say that now. But what we tend to do instead is we get into this speaking ill of our leaders. There's a question about social media. How many of you have ever seen a negative political post on social media? The rest of you are liars, or you've never been on social media, right? Right? If you haven't been on social media, guess what? You're not missing anything. Keep it that way, right? But how many of you made a decision this past political season that you were going to spend less time on the internet because it was so depressing to see what people were posting? Right? That's a genuine statement right there. It got so difficult to wade through all of the negativity because as soon as we don't like something that the other group says, we're all over them. And as long as you're talking about the group that I don't like, well, thumbs up, everything's fine. But as soon as you start talking about my guy, well, no, we got a problem now.
Social media has impacted things big time.
It has changed the world.
But I'm going to take it back a little bit further, and I'm going to say the breakdown of the family unit has affected it even more now.
I agree.
When I got in trouble in school back in the 60s and 70s, I tried my best to not let Mom and Dad know I got in trouble.
Why not?
Because I was in trouble at home.
That's right.
And now you get in trouble, and you take the parents, and the parents get to fuss at the teacher and tell the teacher it's their fault. Basically, we broke down respect.
Right.
And so I really think it began before social media started being as destructive as it is. I went to school saying the Pledge of Allegiance. I had some classes that teacher would let us read a scripture in class, and I'm talking about city schools, and even pray. Mm-hmm. And I won't go off on a wild tangent, but social media has impacted it, but I think it was being impacted before that.
I think that Brother Moore goes into some detail about James chapter 1, 19 and 20, where he talks about how we speak. I'll remind us, Ecclesiastes chapter 10 and verse 2. That's not right, 20. Ecclesiastes 10 and verse 20. Don't even in your thoughts curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich, for a bird of the air may carry your voice, or some winged creature may tell the matter. We are so quick to tear down our leaders when they don't do what we like. And even if they are of the wrong political party, whatever you think the wrong political party is, or whether they're, whatever it is that you disagree with, and they may be flat wrong about it. The Bible tells us that we begin from a position of respect. And so I think we need to be called out in this lesson on the concept of social media and what we do with that. I think that there are passages like Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 2 that say, don't be hasty, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him, and don't be hasty to leave his presence. All right, in other words, show respect. I'm just kind of summarizing that as quickly as I can. In Ecclesiastes 7 verses 9 and 10, it talks about how we let our anger get away from us. Oppression drives the 9 and 10. Chapter 7, be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools. Don't say, why were the former days better than these? Now, you may not say that quote, but what you say is, it was so much better when so-and-so was in office. I just hurt your feelings now, didn't I? But that's what we do. I can't wait till such and such is out of office because so-and-so will be so much better, or it was so much better when. Ecclesiastes chapter 10 says, it is not from wisdom that you say this. Because someone was still being oppressed even in those times. Something was still going wrong. All right, I got 2 comments back there. Amanda? It's a loaded term. It's a very loaded term. That's a good point. Anytime their feelings are hurt. Right. Right. Oppressed. Right. Exactly, which has happened. That's exactly right. So how we define oppression, that's not just hurting your feelings. That's a very good point. I'm glad you brought that up. That's right. Anything that I don't like, well, you're being oppressive, and so you have to quit. That's true. Well, anytime we teach the truth, the Bible is very oppressive in sense of it's not going to give you permission to do an awful lot of stuff that seems really fun at the moment. And so that's oppressive because it says you can't do that. And that doesn't mean that it is. Kevin? How quickly?
We look at it all wrong because you're not going to stop oppression in any form or fashion. Cain oppressed Abel and killed him. And the domino effect will be throughout today.
Right.
Nobody's going to have, no matter which side you're on, which side you're on,
Right.
gun, armament, or anything to solve all problems.
Right.
We have to look at it as instead of trying to solve oppression, stop it. What can I do for not oppression?
That's exactly right. So for the camera's sake, and just in case you didn't hear that, oppression has always been around, and oppression will always be around. There will always be injustice. Let's use that term, injustice. Because as long as there is an imbalance of power, there will be people who are taken advantage of. And we will not be able to solve that. Just like when Jesus said, I've always hated the fact that Jesus said, the poor you will always have with you. Because that sounds like he's saying we can't solve that problem. But he's saying on this earth, there are going to be things that will not be solved until the new kingdom, until eternity comes into play. And so that's one of the reasons we have to keep our eyes on our job to get to that place where there truly will be no more of this problem, of all of these problems that we're talking about, because we're not going to be able to entirely create it here. But then at the same time, does that mean we just give up? Does that mean that Christians should just retreat and go live in a hole in the wall so that because we can't fix every problem for everybody? No. We still are supposed to be that light in the world. We are still supposed to be the opportunity for right and for good. And it may not make a difference in the entire world, but it will eventually make a difference in the lives of individual people, and then those individuals will have an impact on other individuals, and it will spread in that regard.
There's a quote that says, you can't change the world, but you can change someone's world.
That's right, you can change someone's world. Change hearts one at a time. Jimmy, go ahead. What you got? Not watch what? Not just stay off the news. Like Brother Lewis said, you're just going to get a bad sinking feeling in your chest. All right, so time is gone. So I don't know how to skip all the way down to the end of our final thoughts. We did not cover half of the material tonight. Great discussion. I appreciate everybody's thoughts. Adria, what would you like for your final thoughts to be tonight? And Gary, I'll let you share.
I just think you should do what you can, where you can, and with all those around you. And I think if you're doing that, then like y'all said, it's going to spread.
That's an excellent point. Yep. Gary?
Just a couple of things. Go home and read Psalm chapter 37 tonight, the whole chapter. It's really awesome. But basically, you'll get the things that God knows what's going on in this world. He knows the good and the bad, and He's on our side. And then the other thing I'll leave you with is Philippians chapter 3, verse 20. This world's just temporary. We've got our citizenship is in heaven. That's where we're going. We're just trying to get there the easiest way we can, but it's not going to be an easy trip. And just keep focused that, this world one day is going to be over with, and we're going to be in a whole lot better place.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to stir the pot a little bit to give you something to think about when you go home. I'm not going to solve this for you. This is like I've done with the kids before. I'm going to let you struggle with this. We talked about how we shouldn't speak ill of our leaders, but I got another slide on here later on that has passages like when Jesus called Herod a fox, and when John the Baptist stood up to the other Herod because he was married to somebody he shouldn't have been married to. And a passage in 2 Samuel chapter 20 when David is having to flee Jerusalem because Absalom is coming to take over. And there's this guy named Shimei who keeps following David and his entourage out of the city. And he's throwing rocks at him and he's cursing David. And one of David's soldiers says, "Let me go take care of this dog for you. Why should this dog be allowed to insult the king of Israel? That is disrespectful and it's wrong." And David says, let him curse. God's told him to do it. Let him. My own son wants me dead. Why should I worry about what this guy's doing? Let him go. Later on in 1 Kings chapter 18, you have this episode where King Ahab, he meets with Elijah. And King Ahab sees Elijah and he says, "Here comes the troubler of Israel." And Elijah turns it right around and he says, "I'm not the troubler of Israel, you are." He defies the king to his face. They just happen to be standing in a garden when he does it. The garden, by the way, used to belong to this guy you might have heard of named Naboth. That was the guy that Ahab killed so that he could take possession of his lands, his garden. So there are times in the Bible when holy people stood up to religious leaders. In Acts chapter 5, what verse is it? Verse 29. When Peter stands before the Sanhedrin and the Sanhedrin say, "Don't you dare go out and talk about Jesus anymore." What does Peter say? Is it better for us to obey God rather than man? And so there is a time, but what we do in those moments and how we stand out to call out people who are not acting appropriately, to hold them accountable, that is what we as Christians also have an obligation to do in some shape, form, or fashion while we are still trying to live holy in this world. If you figure out how to do that, you come let me know. But I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to another great discussion next week as well. Thank you, Adria. Thank you, Gary. And thank you all. Have a great week.